Okay, I'm going to do this. I've been planning on doing this. Some people have been asking me, namely people who don't know me very well yet, why it is that I do not celebrate the 4th of July. Well, there are many reasons, both personal and political. But the main reason is that I know way too much about the origins of this country, its checkered origins, to really buy the narrative, if you will. The country did not begin in the first place on the 4th of July. It began over a series of fits and starts, and its beginning was predicated by a lot of really unpleasant things. And I'm not much of a patriot, honestly. So, I'm a historian. I look at real stuff. I don't look at the canard that we've been taught to believe. So what I'm going to do in this video is talk a little bit about some of the deeper history of what came before the so-called day that America declared its independence. And I'm going to look back about 100 years or more prior to that date in 1776. And I'm not the only historian who does this, obviously, because my views are supported and upheld by the views of others, even though we may all disagree in other ways. But American independence is one of those interesting ideas. But of course, it was really independence for a few people sitting at the top of a few places. So among the sources I'm going to be using for this is the book on the left, which you'll see, which is called 1676, The End of American Independence by Stephen Saunders Webb, and The Name of War by Jill Lepore, which is an accounting of King Philip's War. And this is where I begin. First of all, this book 1676 is a very interesting text in that it relies heavily on primary sources, on written primary sources, not only from the colonies, but from correspondence and also from the British side of things, the English side of things. And it's divided into 3 parts. And the 3 parts are basically a description of, the first part is a description of King Philip's War. The second part is a description of Bacon's Rebellion. And King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion occurred approximately at the same time in different parts of the American colonies, or what were becoming the American colonies at the time. So King Philip's War happened in what we now call New England, so to speak. And Bacon's Rebellion specifically occurred in the Chesapeake in the colony of Virginia. Now, the reason that this is important for Stephen Saunders Webb is because there is a big chunk of this history. These 2 events are intertwined in a certain way, and there is a certain chunk of this history that has not been told, and he seeks to correct that. So one part of it is about the story is about King Philip's War. The second part, it's like 3 books in one. The second part is about Bacon's Rebellion, and the third part is about the previously unknown players in this whole sequence of events, which were the Haudenosaunee, specifically the chief of the Onondaga at the time. And the reason this is important is because the indigenous people who started King Philip's War or who initiated, they didn't initiate the conflicts, obviously, but they initiated the rebellion that was King Philip's War, or Metacomet's War. This threatened to spill over into all the colonies in the north. And in the west, the rebellion was stopped by the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Mohawk. And the Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee, as led by the Mohawk, because they were the keepers of the Eastern Gate, they were very concerned about this rebellion, not only because it threatened to absorb into it. It was started by a confederacy called the Wabanaki, all right? And this confederacy included most of the Algonquin peoples in Massachusetts, Connecticut, up into Maine. But there was a smaller confederacy called the Abenaki, and they were more closely allied to the Mohicans and to the Mohawk in what would now be eastern New York, Vermont, all right? The Haudenosaunee were very concerned about this rebellion because they didn't want it to inspire their Abenaki allies. And they were afraid that it would also disturb or disrupt some of the trade relationships that they had begun to develop with the English, all right? And this goes back to the Beaver Wars and a whole bunch of other things, which is way beyond the scope of this. But the untold story of the end of American independence is the agreement or the covenant chain that was, or treaty essentially, that was initiated between the Onondaga and the Mohawk. Basically, the Onondaga are sort of the head, if you will, of the Haudenosaunee. Well, not the head, but they are where the council met, is in Onondaga territory, between the Onondaga chieftain who had converted to Christianity, largely due to expediency, maybe some personal conviction, but he sort of saw the writing on the wall, so to speak, and he, through his Mohawk allies, conducted an agreement with the English to help reorganize, if you will, the fortunes of the colonies that would come to be known as New England. It was like the establishment of a new kind of province that would come to be known as New England. And the purpose of this was to create an alliance that would permit the Haudenosaunee to not only survive, but to take over land that had been disputed between them and peoples south of them among the Susquehanna River, other Algonquin peoples. It would permit them to control the Algonquin peoples, but also allow them to become principal trade partners, if you will, with the British, with the English. That would enable them to survive, essentially. So they were willing to kind of sacrifice, if you will, the Wabanaki and even some of their Abenaki Algonquin neighbors, because in order to maintain their own sense of sovereignty. And what Stephen Webb argues is that this covenant chain agreement between the British government, the Parliament, and the Haudenosaunee was absolutely foundational in stripping the colonies, the northern colonies in particular, of their independence, creating this sort of new identity as New Englanders, where we still get the term New England today. A lot of people are like, where is New England? And this kind of explains where that is. But it also set up New York, the state of New York, as a place where a lot of the early fortunes of the Constitution, later Constitution, and also the War of Independence would be fought. And this is true, actually. And so what he's doing is he's re-examining the role of the Haudenosaunee in this whole process. Where Bacon's Rebellion comes into it is that Bacon's Rebellion occurred at about the same time as King Philip's War. And even though the rebellion itself did not last very long, because it involved it involved indentured servants, white and black indentured servants, joining with each other and rebelling against Jamestown and burning Jamestown to the ground. And the main reason for this was because the Jamestown colony, the governor, Berkeley, of Jamestown, of what, the nascent colony of Virginia, had created a boundary line beyond, with an agreement with the indigenous people, the Powhatan and the other indigenous people that were mostly Algonquin, down in what we now call the Mid-Atlantic states, the Chesapeake. And this line prevented colonists from basically seizing indigenous land for their own colonization. Part of the problem, of course, is that the process of indentured servitude required that you work a certain number of years, and then you were supposedly, according to the terms of the servitude, you were supposedly given land that you could settle. Well, eventually, very quickly, the land that had been ceded by indigenous people was used up. And so indentured servants that had been set free, that had, done their time, had taken to seizing indigenous land. And so this agreement had been reached between Governor Berkeley and the various native groups down in what is now Virginia, and in other places that we would, around Maryland and Delaware, et cetera, et cetera. And what ended up happening is that Bacon's Rebellion was an alliance, essentially, between black and white indentured servants not only invading Jamestown and burning it to the ground, but also invading indigenous lands that they could then seize. And even though Bacon's Rebellion itself was stopped pretty quickly, it was considered to be such a failure of governing ability on the part of the Parliament, on the part of Governor Berkeley, according to the Parliament, that they recalled him, and the entire province of Virginia was put under parliamentary rule for a while until they could figure out exactly how to govern it again. And that area became known as the Mid-Atlantic states, not New England, but the Mid-Atlantic states. And one of the fallouts of that was the ruling classes there, the plantation classes, recognized that there was a danger in having blacks and whites unite together. And so that began the process, which started in 1705, of the Virginia colony changing the rules of indentured servitude specifically for black people, so that you began the process of the one drop rule, essentially, so that you would remain enslaved according to the condition of your mother. All right. And so Bacon's Rebellion had these long-standing implications, but of course there's a whole lot more to this. On the right, The Name of War is an account of King Philip's War and what the effect of King Philip's War was, sort of on the mental capacity or the language that New England colonists or English colonists started to use against native peoples. And it also uses all kinds of primary documents, including old newspapers and correspondence and a variety of historical documents, which demonstrate that King Philip's War fundamentally changed how English colonists in particular came to understand their indigenous neighbors. It's also considered by some to be probably the most brutal war in American history, given the small populations at the time and the number of people who were killed. Even though many more indigenous people were killed than English people were killed, the fact is that 1 out of every 10 people, English settlers, was killed in this conflict. So it was an immensely costly war, and it, like I said, it fundamentally changed how the English in particular saw their relationship, especially to their Algonquin neighbors. But of course, this would change. But anyway, so I'm going to give, that's sort of an overview of it, but I'm going to get into some details here in just a sec. This is a map of the locations of some of the principal battles in King Philip's War. It's sometimes called the First Indian War, but it was not, as I will talk about in a little bit. It's also referred to as Metacomet's War or Po-Metacomet's Rebellion. And it actually started in 1675 and lasted for 3 years, but sort of the bulk of the fighting occurred around 1676. And it's named King Philip's War because Metacom, who was the chief of the Wampanoag Confederacy, had adopted the name Philip. His father, Massasoit, was the individual who had made the friendly relationship with the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Pilgrims. But by the time that Metacom came into his own, he was born in 1638, and he was the youngest son of Massasoit. He basically realized that the colonists repeatedly violated their treaty with his father, Massasoit. For example, in 1671, the colonists tried to insist there were peace talks that happened in 1671, and in those peace talks, the English tried to force the Wampanoags to give up their arms, to lay down their guns. There were also conflicts between indigenous Wampanoags and various what were called praying Indian communities. These were Indian communities that had nominally converted to Christianity, and they would often live close to their colonial allies. But the problem was that oftentimes the colonial allies did not really trust the praying Indians, and they would often use them as sort of cannon fodder or buffers between them and the indigenous people. You know, in other words, they weren't trusted by either side, if you will. Essentially, what ended up happening is that in 1675, the various leaders of some of various Wampanoag and Narragansett groups began to raid different settlements. And you can see in this map here, the major Indian attacks or native attacks are the ones that look like sunflower bursts here, and major English counterattacks have the gray in the middle. And you can kind of see where it started and where it led. So this line here, it started up here and came down, well, in both directions, but you can see here that the border is right up against Mohawk territory. And this is, by the way, this is New York right here. This line right here is New York. This is Ulster County. This is Dutchess County. The Mohawks were up here. So this is Greene County and Columbia County right here. So you can see what I was saying here. This is where the Abenaki and the Mohican are, right in here. This is where Vermont is, right in here. So you can see that this rebellion began to spread throughout the greater part of what would be called New England, right up to the Mohawk Abenaki neighbors to the east, essentially. These attacks were devastating, basically. The colonies assembled the greatest army New England had yet mustered, consisting of about 1,000 militia. There were native allies, including the Mohawk, in this. Basically, the Narragansett set probably the largest battle was in Rhode Island, right here. It was called the Great Swamp Fight. An estimated 600 Narragansetts were killed, and their coalition was taken over, and they were pushed back to the borders of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Rhode Island colonies, burning towns as they went. Metacom himself was finally killed at Mount Hope on August 12, 1676. The war was the greatest calamity in 17th century New England and is considered by many to be the deadliest war in colonial history. I'm reading this from Wikipedia, but it's basically correct. In the space of little more than a year, 12 of the region's major towns were destroyed, many more were damaged. The economy of Plymouth and Rhode Island colonies were all but ruined, their populations decimated. They lost 1 out of every 10 people, and more than half of New England's towns were attacked. Hundreds of Wampanoags and their allies were publicly executed or enslaved, and the Wampanoags were effectively left landless. And in fact, that has implications for the present day, because just last year, the state of Massachusetts denied the Wampanoags some land that had been given back to them, and this animosity goes back to this, essentially. If you want to look up all the particulars, you can find it. But this war had extraordinary consequences for the reestablishment of English hegemony in the region. In fact, according to the author of 1676, the province or the region that would come to be known as New England was essentially established as a means by which to join the interests of all the colonies together into one unit, more or less, that at least in England it was thought would be ruled by one governor. So previously there were different governors for these different colonies, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts. But after this, the English were going to try to have one governor ruling all of it. And this is one map that was proposed for the area that is called New England. And you can see here the Hudson River running up along the western side here. And that, of course, is the New York boundary right there. But this whole area was once referred to as New England. So that's where that term comes from, is New England. Now, obviously, when we think of New England now, we think of a much larger area than that. This is what we tend to think of when we think of New England. It's Maine all the way down to it's New York. New York City is right here at the bottom corner to your left. That little tiny red dot there, right down there, that little tiny red dot, and all of Maine, and you see New Hampshire and Vermont and Connecticut. And here's the Hudson River here. So even the Hudson River in the eastern part of New York, as well as some of the Catskills and stuff, is all sort of considered New England. And part of the reason for that is because the conflict that King Philip's War began, the rebellion that King Philip's War began, continued to the north for another decade or so. Even though Metacomet died in 1676, and there were scattered rebellions all through this area here through 1678. There were repeated, because there were other Algonquin confederacies up here. They continued until for another decade or so, until they were finally quelled. Now, Maine itself did not exist actually as a state, and this is important to remember, or even as a colony, until after the Revolutionary War in 1776. Maine was a place that people down here who lived in New England proper, for those people who didn't want to participate in the War of Independence, they would actually move up into Maine, which at the time was called the Great Frontier. They would move up in here to escape being tarred and feathered as Tories or as supporters of the British against the English cause. What you have to keep in mind here all the time is that the Hudson River here acted as sort of a bulwark on the western side of it, although into Vermont here as well, but mostly on the western side of it. You have the Mohawk, you have the Haudenosaunee, the keepers of the Eastern Gate, as the Haudenosaunee refer to them, and then to the left, or the right, I should say, or the east of the Hudson River, you have the Abenaki, who were a loose coalition of Algonquin peoples that were often associated or affiliated with the Mohawk for a variety of political and economic reasons. Now, going further south into the Chesapeake is, and this of course is the Chesapeake here. This is what's now part of Maryland, part of Virginia down in here. This is the part of Virginia that was colonized at the time. You can see it's not nearly as large as Virginia became. And here you have a map of English settlements. The English settlements are the little dots. All right. The native villages are the ones that look like little teepees, and then the English forts are the X's. So you can see that there are there's quite a variety of people who actually live in this area at the time. Now, Bacon's rebellion was a short-lived rebellion that was led by Nathaniel Bacon, and it was held by Virginia settlers, mostly indentured servants, both black and white, and took place from 1676 to 1677. And it was against the colonial governor of Virginia, William Berkeley. And this was after, as I mentioned, Berkeley refused to aid Bacon in the killing and forceful removal of the indigenous people from the colony of Virginia. Thousands of Virginians from all classes, including those in indentured servitude and races, rose up in arms against Berkeley, chased him from Jamestown. Where was Jamestown? Jamestown was right in here. Chased him from Jamestown and drove him out, essentially. And then after they drove him out, see, this was Bacon's quarter here. After they drove him out, here's Jamestown. I couldn't see it for some reason. It's right down there. It's Jamestown. Basically, what forces loyal to Bacon did was once they burned Jamestown to the ground and drove Governor Berkeley out, then they began to invade Indian villages to try to drive them specifically out. It was basically the first rebellion in North American colonies in which discontented frontiersmen took part in. There was a similar uprising in Maryland, which is right here, that took place a little bit after Bacon's rebellion occurred. But it was basically the first time in which individuals, colonists in the New World, rebelled against British rule or English rule, so to speak. So basically what ended up happening is that Parliament was responding to both King Philip's War and to what was happening in Bacon's Rebellion. Since they were occurring at the same time, it basically looked to Parliament like England was losing control of its colonies, all right, to both indigenous people and to indentured servants, essentially. That's what it looked like, even though the Bacon's Rebellion was a lot larger than that in terms of the people who participated. So what happened in this area, as I mentioned, was that the alliance between European indentured servants and Africans disturbed the colonial upper classes. And the Africans at this time, the Africans that were in Virginia, were a mix of indentured servants, people who were actually enslaved, and there were also a class of free blacks that had existed for a couple of generations previous to this. And this alliance between white indigenous servants and Africans disturbed the upper classes, and they responded by hardening the racial caste of slavery in an attempt to divide the two races from subsequent united uprisings with the passage of the Virginia Slave Codes in 1705. And like I said earlier, that was the beginning of the one drop rule in Virginia, which would be adopted widely by many of the southern states in particular. Now, obviously, there were other conflicts. There were conflicts between indigenous people and colonists that had come prior to this, but there were also conflicts that came after this, as you know. One of the things that 1676, the book, does not do a good job of, but then of course it's not his focus, is he doesn't look at the importance that the Great Law of Peace had for the Haudenosaunee prior to their entering into this covenant chain with the British government. He is of the opinion, Dr. Webb is of the opinion, that, and he is a historian who holds this opinion, that the Great Law of Peace did not exist prior to the colonial experience with the Haudenosaunee. And there's a lot of historical and oral history evidence contrary to that. But there's a group of historians, a school of historians, that don't rely on anything other than somewhat written records, because they regard the oral history of indigenous people as hearsay. So he seems to be that way. There is plenty of evidence that the Haudenosaunee Law of Peace pre-existed the colonial experience, their colonial experience, for centuries prior to white people, encountering them. Although what I will say is that it is probable that once the Haudenosaunee began to have extended relationships with various European groups, that the French and the English and the Dutch, that it changed the nature of how the Confederacy reacted, I think, that, or responded or dealt with those things. Especially the Beaver Wars did that. So I think it's probably pretty clear that even though the Confederacy pre-existed European colonial expansion, that European colonial expansion probably changed the dynamic, the internal political dynamic of the Haudenosaunee fairly significantly. One of the people to talk specifically about this in some depth is Barbara Alice Mann, and she alludes to this She talks more about it in other texts, but she alludes to this process of change and transformation in this book, George Washington's War on Native America, which is one of the main reasons why I cannot study, why I can study it, but I cannot observe or celebrate the War of Independence. This book is basically about how the relationship, the attempts of the Haudenosaunee to manage their relationship with growing colonial power, especially after the French and Indian Wars, or the what's called the 6 Years' War by the English, which created what was called the Proclamation Line of 1763, which was a line that was drawn by the British colonial government, by the British government, the Parliament, in order to prevent the colonies from expanding any more westward. And this was an agreement that was made between various indigenous groups and the French. Actually, the French were present during this, and the Parliament. And of course, the colonies didn't like that at all. So that was one of the beefs. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, one of the beefs there is that the British government has encouraged the fomenting of indigenous rebellions against the colonists. And they're referring to the law of the Proclamation Line of 1763. But one of the things that this book here talks about is how, and she just refers to it as previous agreements that the Haudenosaunee had entered into with the British, eventually led to a split in the Confederacy, a split in the Haudenosaunee. The Seneca in particular, they are the keepers of the Western Gate. They really didn't, they were not, I mean, the Seneca themselves were split as well. I mean, not only did a lot of the Seneca split with the Mohawk and the Onondaga over this alliance, this growing alliance with the American colonies, but the Seneca themselves split. And it led to a fracturing of the Confederacy, and that even though the Confederacy still sort of exists, so to speak, it's a lot of those old animosities between, say, the Seneca and the Mohawk, and the Seneca and the Onondaga, a lot of those things still continue to the present day. So this book talks about those splits and how the early American government, namely George Washington, used those splits specifically against the Seneca and other groups like the Cayuga and the Oneida and Onondaga in order to gain ascendancy in the western part of Pennsylvania and New York, so that they could move into the Ohio Valley, because the Ohio Valley was sort of the new frontier for the colonial government, or the new American colonial government. So some of those splits that I was alluding to, the changes that occurred in the Haudenosaunee as a result of the agreements that were made in 1676. This is part of what Barbara Alice Mann is talking about in this book. It's obviously a very complicated history, but the point is that indigenous peoples played a really important role, for good and ill, for themselves and others, in the years leading up to our War of Independence. And they influenced our understanding of what a new nation could look like. And in fact, the new nation, once our Constitution was established, which was at least a decade after our independence, our Constitution looks a lot more like the law of peace in some ways than it does about anything in Parliament. Although it's a mix, But if you're interested in knowing what kind of influence the Haudenosaunee had on the establishment of our form of government, you can look not only at Barbara Alice Mann, but you can also look at the book 1491, which has an entire chapter about that, and how the Great Law of Peace, especially through emissaries like Benjamin Franklin, who admired it, and a couple of other of our founding fathers who were aware of it, how it became sort of one of the models, not the only model, but one of the models that was used to try to create this new nation out of nothing. Now, like I mentioned, there were also other rebellions. In the Hudson Valley, for example, prior to Bacon's Rebellion, prior to King Philip's War, there were a series of rebellions and two distinct wars called the Esopus Wars, the Esopus War 1 and 2, which involved Dutch settlers and the Munsee people that lived here where I live. In fact, where I live is kind of one of the centers of where the first and the second Esopus Wars began. Those wars were concluded by the 1640s, early 1650s, but they did fundamentally shape how New Yorkers understood their relationship with native peoples. And those wars and the weakening of the Algonquin confederacies in the Hudson Valley emboldened the Mohawk to begin moving down south towards their old enemies, the Susquehanna. So those wars did have implications for how the Mohawk would behave later on. And then in 1680, which is, about 5 or 6 years after, or 4 or 5 years after Bacon's Rebellion, there was another revolt, but this was in the Southwest, in the part of the country we now call New Mexico. And this was a remarkable revolt. It's called the Pueblo Revolt, or Pope's Revolt. And it was a remarkable revolt against all of the Pueblo communities in a region as large as New Mexico that succeeded in driving out the Catholic Church and all Spanish colonists for the better part of a decade. And what's remarkable about it was that it was all done, the organization for it was all done clandestinely. When you read about it now, it sounds very much like the Delhi revolt in the 19th century, when the first great revolt against the British, or the Raj in northern India, where basically you had people behind the scenes and underneath, communicating over a broad area and all agreeing on when the revolt would occur. And of course, this was occurring without any mass communication, without any, just using the forms of communication that indigenous people had among the different Pueblo nations that existed, because there's a wide variety of Pueblo nations. Americans today, white Americans, tend to think of all Pueblo people as being exactly the same, and they're not. They're a very diverse group of different people who do not even all belong to the same language families, but they have come to live in one basic area, and they've come to live in a particular set of ways because they all share a similar kind of desert environment. And so they're all, Pueblo. The Spanish saw that Pueblo means city. They all saw them as being basically the same people. Well, they each of these different towns, some are Hopi, some are Zuni, some are Tiwa. They're different groups of people, but each one of these towns had their own history, their own culture, their own rituals, and for them to join together in a concerted revolt to throw out the Spanish is an extraordinary story that I think most Americans should know about. This book, there's this book called The Pueblo Revolt, and then there's another book that's been made into an Audible edition, which I highly recommend. And the book the Audible book called The Pueblo Revolt, basically the author of that, he has gone to great lengths to go to each one of the villages, since a lot of these Pueblo villages still exist, and to talk to the elders in these villages about their participation in their ancestors' participation in the Pueblo Revolt, because those records are still there, both by oral tradition and written tradition. It's extraordinary. So it isn't just what happened here, in New England. It's what was happening in other parts of the world, other parts of North America, other parts of Turtle Island. And these are stories of independence and revolt that, to me, are more meaningful than our own supposed history here in the United States. So I've gone on for quite a while. You can listen to this and check out some of these publications, but it's all of these stories that, for me, make our simple observation of Independence Day just actually not very meaningful. And on top of that, firecrackers are really bad for the environment. Fireworks harm animals and harm people. In my neighborhood, when the firecrackers go off, when my neighbors do it, it freaks the animals out here. For days afterwards, the birds are confused. They're upset. The animals are confused and upset. We shouldn't do this. It's just not, it's not healthy for us or for other living things to blow up stuff just because we want to blow up stuff. And I don't like loud noises anymore anyway. But in any case, this is my take on it. And as a coda, to just finish this up after listening, I realized that I did not provide the name of the Onondaga sachem who presided over this covenant chain. He was called by the English Daniel Garakonte. He also obviously had an Onondaga name, but in the records, he actually preferred to be called by his Christian name, which he had adopted. So Daniel Garakonte is the Onondaga sachem. Edmund Andros was the governor of New York, and James Stewart, the Duke of York and Albany, and the proprietor of the province. And it was they that created the mechanism of the covenant chain that would be used to create the province, if you will, of New England. So, as this book puts it, the great achievement of Daniel Garakonte and Edmund Andros was the interethnic, intercolonial, and international covenant chain. In 1676, the sachem and the soldier presided over the creation of the first American frontier, and that's kind of how New England was understood. This boundary between the coastal colonies of the English and an interior Iroquoian or Haudenosaunee sphere split eastern America along a line from the Penobscot, that's Maine, to the Dan. This Anglo-Iroquois frontier was the first mechanism of Iroquoian empire. I alluded to that with the desires of the Mohawk to expand, then the vehicle of English conquest, and finally the matrix of American expansionism. Ever since 1676, the concept of the frontier has controlled our understanding of the character and culture of the United States. What has been forgotten is that the first American frontier was a shared enterprise of the Haudenosaunee and the English. So that's part of where he gets the idea that New York was called the Empire State, because it wasn't just the empire of the Dutch or the empire of the English or the French, but it was also the empire of the Haudenosaunee, who centered, of course, their confederacy in the northern tier of New York, or what would become New York. So that's a little bit of a coda. I forgot to mention that before. And as the coda to the coda, this covenant chain legally existed until 1982. This covenant chain between the Haudenosaunee and the English or British Parliament. This covenant chain existed until 1982 when it was finally rescinded by Margaret Thatcher's government. Why are we not surprised?